Hi, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of William & Mary's third annual Professionals Week. I am Michael Steelman, Director of Alumni Career Management and Professional Networks for William & Mary. It is my pleasure to work with each of you and all the wonderful members of the William & Mary community to provide valuable career resources and professional events to enhance and strengthen our William & Mary professional networks. Throughout this week, an emerging theme has been the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in supporting individuals and organizations to thrive. Today, we are going to spend the afternoon taking a deeper dive into DE&I best practices and how to create and cultivate a more inclusive workplace. Thank you for joining us. It is now my great pleasure to invite my colleague, my friend and mentor, Dr. Valerie Cushman, to kick off this afternoon of programming and moderate our esteemed panel. Val is a Senior Director of Alumni Engagement and Inclusion Initiatives at William & Mary, and over the past 5.5 years, she has built resources and programs to enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion across the programming and vision of the William & Mary Alumni Association. If you have not had the pleasure of getting to know Val, I highly recommend reaching out to her after this event and get more engaged with her initiatives. Now, without further ado, Val, please take it away.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to take part in our third annual Professionals Week and to bring to light the expertise of 3 alumni who are doing impactful work in the DE&I space. We'll kick off our program today with a keynote and then transition to our panel of experts. As questions come to mind through the keynote and the panel, please do drop them in the Q&A, and we will address as many as we can at the end of the program. Let me now introduce our keynote speaker. Shuchi Sharma is the Global Vice President and co-lead of Inclusive Career Journeys at SAP, driving the strategy that supports SAP's goal to obtain 30% women in leadership positions in 2022. In this role, she leads, designs, and implements the strategy to ensure inclusion is integrated into the fabric of how employees experience their career journey at SAP. She works with global stakeholders throughout the organization to create and deliver initiatives designed to embed equity into processes and foster a culture of inclusion toward SAP achieving their equity goals. Shuchi serves as a subject matter expert on gender-related issues and oversees SAP's gender intelligence programs, including their Women's Professional Growth webinar series, Activating Men for Parity, and collaborates closely with SAP's Business Women's Network. Shuchi was recently named one of the Financial Times 50 Future Leaders and Diversity MBA Journal's Top 100 Executive Leaders and Top 100 Women of Influence. She has over 17 years experience advancing women within the technology and healthcare industry. Shuchi graduated from William & Mary with a chemistry major in 1992, received her master's in organic chem from William & Mary in 1993, and her MPH from the University of Michigan. In her spare time, she serves on the board of the Maryland Legislative Agenda for Women, works as an AAUW Start Smart salary negotiation facilitator, and advocates for women and families through work with Moms Rising. Shuchi's talk today is entitled Embedding Inclusion into the Future of Work. Shuchi.
Thank you, Val. Thank you, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I can't tell you how nice this is to be among friends for the afternoon. So thank you for having me. And before I begin, I have to tell you, you probably noticed my background. I chose the Sadler Terrace for my background today. I would love to be there on a beautiful sunny day, sitting and chatting with others of you. And I always felt when I go back to William & Mary that, oh gosh, I wish I could have enjoyed this building and this beautiful space when I was a student. But then I was reminded of the fact that I actually knew Dean Sadler. How many of you out there today knew Dean Sadler, for whom this beautiful building is named? I'm guessing quite a few of you in the audience. And, you know, in the spirit of what I want to talk to you about today, Dean Sadler really embodied inclusion for me. I don't know if you all remember, but he was just this incredibly gregarious, friendly leader of William & Mary who made himself so accessible. He would walk around campus and greet you. He knew your name. I'll never forget, he would just saddle right up to you when you were walking to class, put his arm around your shoulder and ask you, how are you doing? What's going on? In the cafeteria one day, he pulled up next to me. I had my tray and he showed me, he's like, I'm going to show you how to make this amazing drink. And I thought, what is going on? And he starts mixing grape juice and milk and teaches me how to make what he calls a purple cow. And, you know, he embodied inclusion because he created this environment where you felt like somebody cared and you felt like you belonged there. And at its essence, that is what a culture of inclusion is all about. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'm going to share some of my slides with you so you can follow along in the discussion. So I want to talk to you about embedding inclusion into the future of work. What does that look like? It's a pretty hot topic these days. And I'm going to start the same way one of my absolute favorite professors started his lecture on American foreign policy. He just went up to the blackboard one day and just wrote one word on the blackboard, and that framed the entire semester of our discussion. So today we're going to talk about VUCA. What is VUCA? It's becoming a word on its own, but it is an acronym. And VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think we're all probably on the same page that this is the world we are living in, right? Just look at the last 2 weeks of what happened in Texas. Incredible volatility due to climate change. The uncertainty of the pandemic, and the complexity that has entered our lives as a result. We've seen social unrest, we've seen sharp political division, and ambiguity around the future. I think we're all feeling this sense of what is going to happen, right? And, you know, if there's one very compelling reason why inclusion is so important to build into how we work and how we do things, it is because we need diversity, and it doesn't thrive without inclusion. So, for example, if you look at what happened to food and agricultural systems during the pandemic, those systems which were very sort of homogenous and catered to large institutions, when the pandemic hit, those agricultural chains and systems, they fell apart, right? Because they couldn't pivot. But if you looked at the agricultural practices of farmers who maybe had 10 crops, yes, very hard to maintain, very difficult to manage that practice. However, in times of great crisis, that diversity allowed them to pivot, it allowed them to be agile, and it allowed them to thrive. So yes, while diversity may create some inefficiency, there's an incredible amount of resiliency that's built into those organizations, systems, and institutions that allows them to thrive in periods of great instability and uncertainty. And beyond that, there is such a compelling argument to be made for why it matters. If you take all of those factors out, we know that it drives employee engagement. We know inclusion drives innovation, and that innovation is what spurs our ability to keep customers and gain new ones. And it's no doubt that, you know, this is known. There are over 200 studies out there that show us that diversity and inclusion have a very strong business case. And we see the results over and over and over again. And one of the things I want you to take away is that this is one of the most compelling business issues of our time. It is not an HR issue. It is a business issue. It is a leadership issue. And so for that reason, we need to think about how we embed inclusion into how we work and our systems and processes that drive our long-term organizational culture. But why is this so hard? Two reasons. One, we're individuals and our brains are wired for bias. Two, a lot of that bias, as we know, has been hardwired into our systems, our institutions of society, and all of the messages that surround us and drive culture. And unless we become more and more aware of that and our role, the role we as individuals play in changing that, it will be hard to change. I've got a dear friend from William and Mary named Peter Callahan, and when I talk to him about this work, he's always says to me, Shuchi, this is an incredibly sophisticated problem and challenge that's built on hundreds of years of established practices and traditions. And he's right, right? So there's a lot of work to do. But where do we start? One, if you look at organizations, you'll see that they have varying levels of maturity, right? We have organizations that are compliance focused, that just simply don't want to actually break the law. We have organizations that start to really promote D&I through programmatic interventions. And then finally, we see that organizations start to move towards more leader-owned D&I before they really enter into an inclusive culture. Now, where do you think most organizations are today? Probably between level 1 and level 2, some between level 2 and level 3, but not much farther. We have quite a ways to go. However, it can be done. And really where it starts with ourselves. Even at the very, very top of organizations, we have to think about our own values, our own behaviors. And as we begin to change those behaviors, we have the ability to not only impact our own behaviors, but the entire systems of an organization. And as leaders, I encourage you to think about that and think about what are some of the ways you can change processes in your organization as they relate to your employees that are going to start to really root out bias that may have been built into the systems and processes over a long period of time. And each of us has the opportunity to really move ourselves and our organizations from this stage of awareness. We know we have something to do, to really acting as an ally, to further to being a real agent for change. At SAP, where I work, we have about 100,000 people in our organization. And our approach to D&I is to really look at this from the employee's perspective. We center everything around the employee experience, and we structure it in 3 pillars. The first is to look across the whole career journey and say, okay, where do we have our deepest, most embedded bias? And how do we remove that? We look at things, everything from hiring to promotion to progression to the point at which an employee exits. Every point along that has the opportunity to be a meaningful, inclusive experience. We look at our culture and how do we hold leaders accountable? How do we enable our leaders to demonstrate inclusive behaviors? And then how do we multiply our impact and create a diverse ecosystem to ensure our products are accessible and to ensure that our supplier ecosystem is as diverse as possible? And ultimately, we want to use technology to drive this impact to our customer base. Now, how do we make all of this happen? A couple different ways. So we spend a lot of time focusing with our leaders on setting ambitious targets. We've put a lot of policies in place to ensure that we have long-term sustainable change. Communications, incredibly important. So we focus very much on how do we ensure we have a very inclusive communication strategy. So for example, as a technology company, as many of you may know, there's a language that is used in the technology space of master and slave. We've removed that to make our communications and the way our vocabulary in the organization more inclusive. And then we have a whole suite of programs and initiatives for each of these 3 pillars designed to ensure that we can really drive some of that sustainable on the ground change within the organization globally. So one example is when you look across your whole career journey, there's a possibility for bias in every space. And one of the ways that you can think about that is to think, where does the informality lie? Because that's where the bias creeps in. So if you look at how your women and underrepresented minorities are promoted in the organization, you may see very different data. If you look at how individuals are paid, how are they hired? Where do you source candidates? How do you interview? Where is the informality in your processes? And that is where you will find there often is a lot of bias. So what does the future of diversity and inclusion look like? In order for us to embed inclusion into the future of work, we know we have to have a global focus. We've got to regionally adapt, but we've got to have a global focus. Structural solutions, incredibly important, right? This is very, very difficult work in terms of changing processes, but it's those long-term structural solutions that are going to drive change. Long-term investments, absolutely required, along with universal ownership, right? Everybody has to own this in your organization. And then the foundation upon which it all rests, I would say, is really data-driven decision-making. Everything's got to be data-driven. And with that, I'll leave you with one thought for the future. We are not responsible for this problem. However, we are all responsible for the solution. And with that, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. I'll turn it back over to Val and any questions we might have.
Thank you very much. And Shuchi, I think we might hold on questions to the end, but I know at least I do, and I suspect our participants today, very much appreciate your focus on the strategic and corporate-wide approach to achieving equity and advancing inclusion. I was particularly taken by putting the employee at the center when you think about the model of your work. So thank you very much for launching sort of bringing us in, helping us to focus, and launching what will now be our panel of experts on this topic. So I welcome Latoya Asia J.D, class of 09 from William & Mary, and Logan Scott, class of 2013, to our conversation. And so with that, thank you, Michael, for reminding me to launch my video. I would like to ask, sorry, folks, I have lost my talking points here, but let's start with Logan and Latoya introducing themselves, and by doing that, answering this question, what has been your path and passion to diversity, equity, and inclusion work in your own careers and professional lives? Latoya, could you start for us?
Sure. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So thank you again for having me. This is a fantastic panel, and Shuchi, thank you for that wonderful presentation. Very enlightening and eye-opening to many degrees. So, this is a really interesting question because I feel, really as though DE&I has been really embedded in who I am from the very beginning of life. So it's really hard to pinpoint kind of when I started the work itself. But, I was raised in a multicultural household, and I think that's probably what initially sparked kind of this desire and really made me kind of look at things a little bit differently from a different lens. My mom is Panamanian, my dad is American, and my dad was in the military and he was stationed in Panama. That story, they came over to the United States. And I think just kind of growing up in this kind of these different dynamics in the household really just, made things stand out a lot more to me. So as I kind of went through schooling and went down the path, I noticed kind of underrepresentation or things that just didn't feel or look right. And so even before I really knew exactly what, DEI was, it was something that I was really attracted to and wanting to find ways to kind of close those gaps and make sure that, people were represented, particularly people that look like me. So all throughout, law school, when I was at William & Mary, I worked on the undergrad campus in the Center for Student Diversity and, was heavily involved in, some of the organizations like Black Law Student Association and other organizations that, really were building the pipelines for, Black lawyers and making it possible for, lawyers to serve underrepresented communities. When I moved into the law firm setting, I was, heavily involved in diversity initiatives that similarly, helped to build the pipeline of minority attorneys. And really, just advocate for other opportunities in the law firm setting, and just continued on various panels and, speaking on women initiatives and workplace balance, and really a huge emphasis, as Shuchi has talked about, on kind of this concept of inclusion. And that's something that has really kind of stood out for me as I've, gone through these different paths, because, we all know that you can have the numbers of individuals, whether it's in the organization, the school, or whatever the setting, but if the individual is not actually included and involved in feeling a sense of belonging within the organization, then you're essentially going to have a revolving door. So really, again, all of these experiences led to my work with DE&I, and probably the first official capacity or time that I really worked in the space was when I was at E-Trade as in-house counsel, and I joined as an employment attorney, but very quickly realized that there was not a formal, program in place, and wanted to get involved with helping to, stand up the efforts there. So I worked very closely with HR and others in the organization to, help develop a strategic planning committee and, stand up the employee resource groups. And so that's just something that I just continue my work today. As I mentioned to the panelists earlier, I think that sometimes people think, that you have to have the title, right? You have to be the DE&I person, head of D&I, but we can all do something. And as Shuchi has said, again, I mean, as individuals, we can all kind of move organizations forward, whatever role that may be. And so my role currently, I'm at Dominion Energy as managing counsel over labor and employment, but still something that continues. It's a part of my DNA and to be part of the efforts to enhance diversity at the organization. So that's how I got here.
Latoya, thanks. Matt, I really appreciate your remarks around it not having to be your title. We appreciate and need those people who have that title, but it takes the full gamut to really create change. So Logan, speaking of someone with the title, yes.
Right. Hi, Val, and everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Really glad to be here. Logan Scott. My current role is manager for diversity, equity, and inclusion with the Walt Disney Company. I'll talk a little bit about the personal and professional path that kind of led me there. My first career decision in HR actually was with a German company. I worked as an HR generalist for them. They're basically the Walmart of the EU, and they're now here in the US. And I started as an HR generalist, and that was fortunate for me because I was able to truly generalize and understand different areas of human resources. And so I learned quickly that if I were going to work in corporate America, A, it would be in human resources, and B, specifically, I would choose to specialize in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that is an area that complements who I am by nature. Latoya talked a bit about her upbringing and family. And certainly my upbringing has a lot to do with it. And I count that at the College of William and Mary as well, where I had a lot of friends who were international. I am a member of the LGBT community, but my earliest introduction into a dimension of diversity, equity, inclusion was around persons with disabilities because of a gene on my mother's side. And I realized the inequity around that early in life and what privilege meant outside of skin color, but around physical abilities. And so that has always been a part of my own journey. And so when I really understood what diversity, equity, inclusion was all about, it is about the things that Logan Scott is about. And so what I do doesn't even feel like work because I do love it so much. And when my time was up at Lidl, the German company that I worked for, I moved into human capital consulting with Deloitte, proud Deloitte alumnus on this call as well. While I served my country in broader HR roles, I was still supporting women at Deloitte, the transgender and non-binary practitioner community at the firm, and new hires to the firm, particularly new hires who were not right out of undergrad. And so working with those populations was still woven into my day-to-day work at the firm. All that to say, those experiences led me to do what I do now, which is really help to execute the strategy for diversity, equity, and inclusion at the company that I work for now. And it's a really fascinating time to be doing this work anywhere because of 2020 and the moments that happen across that year that have truly led to, if organizations allow themselves to, a movement for this kind of work.
Logan, thank you. So two things come to mind from that. One, I've always wondered how to pronounce Lidl, so thank you for sharing that. And,
sure.
And two, I think you both, Latoya and Logan and Shuchi as well, spoke to the personal passion that goes into this and not thinking of it as work, but really personally rewarding to you. And I think that makes a difference for everyone who's engaged in this space, whether they hold the title or not. So now for all panelists, to really get to brass tacks, there are certain things that we do, and Shuchi really highlighted some of the strategies, but can you share a specific practice or a policy at the employer level that you have seen have a positive impact? And maybe speak a little bit to the sustainability of those, because that's certainly something we also need to strive toward. So Shuchi, do you want to launch us on that question? Practice or policy you've seen work and how you're sustaining it?
Sure, thank you. So there's many. There are, I would say, if you look across the entire employee journey, you can talk about hiring and promotion. One of the areas we've had a lot of success in and probably been very vocal in the market is around pay equity, right? How we address pay equity. That's to me, a basic hygiene feature around equity and inclusion, and building a sustainable methodology in your organization to look at compensation on a regular basis. A lot of times organizations will do pay audits every now and then, but how do you actually build into your annual comp and calibration policies a way to look at pay equity? So that's something we've done. And when you add in policies that are going to sustain that change for the long term, you're more likely to see a sustainable impact in your organization. The second, I would say, Val, is hiring. The way we look at hiring is we're looking at how do we ensure that we are welcoming candidates into our organization and ensure they experience inclusion right away. So we start that process by changing our sourcing. And then we've also implemented diverse hiring panels. So we have a diverse interview panel as well as a candidate panel, right? Because if you increase the diversity around who interviews and who is being interviewed, then you're more likely to see a different outcome.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Latoya, from your seat, something that's worked, how you're sustaining it.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I would definitely second the diverse slates, the candidate slate and interview panels. I think, it's one of those things that, again, unless you're intentional and in trying to increase diversity and focused on sourcing. It's going to take a lot longer than if otherwise. But one of the things I would say, particularly to organizations who are kind of starting off, because I know, as Logan mentioned, the year 2020, came at us full force, and there's a lot of focus in this area. And while there are a lot of organizations that have been, doing this for a long time, there are quite a number that are now kind of really focusing on it and becoming intentional. So one of the things that I would say, really taking an audit or an assessment of kind of where you are as an organization, even if you do not have any kind of formal program or policies in place around diversity and inclusion. So whether that's, engagement surveys or other, otherwise essentially surveying your employees and really trying to get a lay of the land, looking at policies, is language inclusive, some of the things that Shuchi talked about in terms of, that inclusiveness, kind of where are we at this point? Because one I've found is organization is, it's all right, we doing this, let's take that. And kind of just slap it on and hope for the best. But at the end of the day, every organization is very different. Cultures are very different, starting at different places, whether there's something formal or not in place. So really, stepping back and looking. And the second thing, it sounds very simple, but really having dedicated resources, dedicated, diversity, inclusion resources and money, right? Because these things, just like any other business initiative or program or part of an organization, you need to have something dedicated to in order to ensure that you're being intentional. And so again, I think those are kind of like foundational things, but I think very helpful. And when we talk about sustainability, if we want a program and a culture really around inclusion and belonging that's going to last, we have to look at where we are and build and make sure that whatever we're doing, all the policies and things that we're putting into place actually work for the company and actually kind of, we're starting where we need to start and not getting too ahead of ourselves to make sure that it lasts. So that would be my thoughts there.
Excellent. Thank you, Latoya. Logan, Walt Disney is known for their expertise and accomplishments in this area. What is the one practice or policy that you think has made a difference?
Sure. I would say program development that is intentional around sponsorship. So, sometimes depending on I think to Latoya's point, understanding the maturity of an organization is really important. And for us, and for Deloitte too, there's not always necessarily a diversity issue. That can be an issue in certain aspects, certain organizations, sub-organizations, subgroups, right? But inclusion is also a really big challenge, right? To what Shuchi said earlier, you can have, I'm paraphrasing because this is something that I say, but you can have all the diversity in the world, right? And if folks don't feel included, that is welcomed, valued, appreciated, and heard, they leave, they become, less engaged, right? So I think sponsorship shows an intentional, unequivocal investment in the talent that you already have. And that these sponsors, these senior executive level individuals will take ownership for helping to create a path for other individuals, for diverse talent that already exists in the organization, and that you will be an advocate for them and not a mentor. Those aren't the same things. I know everyone knows that, but I'm just clearly calling that out, right? And so when you have a program that is designed to do something like that, that is something that is sustainable and successful for keeping the diverse talent that you work so hard to attract in the first place.
Logan, thank you. And we have 72 people participating in this webinar, and a lot of probably really good ideas and people who have experienced, employed, or seen practices and policies that work in your environments. And I'd like to do a community share through the chat. As you see, I've dropped in a couple of summarizing what Shuchi and Logan and Latoya have shared. We'd love for all of our participants to share ideas from their workspaces that they have found to work. So please use the chat and provide some short phrases about what you are seeing working in your spaces. Speaking of, Logan, you just referenced, retaining talent. There no doubt are some people on the call today who are in the job seeking mode. And we have people who are in the hiring mode as well. And so Logan or Latoya, could you give us some feedback on what advice you would give for hiring managers? And then we'll flip the coin next and provide advice for those who are currently seeking employment in a new space. So Logan and Latoya, let's start with Logan. Advice for hiring managers.
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing is to, think about the job description itself and make sure that that is as fair and equitable as it should and could be, right? Don't just recycle a job description from a few years ago. Take time to think about, why you're hiring this person and what they need to have. And to that end, determine early on key competencies, no more than 5 key competencies that this person should be meeting, and be willing to ask yourself, like, how ask yourself about the short term, the midterm, and the long term fulfilling this role, right? If you want someone to come into this role who is sort of this perfect candidate, the notion of that, right? Well, the perfect candidate comes in and they have all of these skills and the background and the experience. Perhaps they're also going to become pretty bored with this role early on and become less engaged, right? So think about the competencies that you want, and then the areas where there is wiggle room and where you can compromise and perhaps take what would be deemed perhaps a risk in this area, right? Because if you want to, again, retain talent, it's not just about getting them in the door today, right? You want to think about the next quarter, the next year, the next 2 years that this person, that this talent has come into the role, right? So think sort of broadly and not just about today and tomorrow and next week. And I think the final recommendation or advice I have around this space was mentioned earlier, which is around assembling, being intentional about the assembly of the interview panel, right? Who are the individuals that you will tap to help interview candidates for this role, right? Think about their tenure with the company, think about their gender, think about their professional background experience, and the significance that diversity of thought, particularly around interviewing a candidate, can have, and that can be super beneficial. But I do quickly want to go back to the idea of setting those 5 key competencies, because it's not enough to just set those, but organize your questions around those key competencies and give candidates the fair opportunity to answer those questions and be consistent, right? If Val, Latoya, and I are all interviewing for the same position, well, then Michael should have his 5 competencies or his 3 competencies and have those double click into the questions around those competencies and ask each of us the same questions in the same order to provide more equity. Thank you.
No, thank you, Logan. Latoya, your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, I have very similar thoughts. And I think with all of this, I look at this kind of under the umbrella of, really holding our leaders accountable, those that, should be modeling this behavior, from the top, so that this is not just something, that, certain level hiring managers are doing, but that this is something from the very top when we're filling roles that are the most visible, that we're going through the same process and not just tapping, somebody that we know, whether it's board positions, C-suite positions, and otherwise, and, really rewarding publicly or otherwise rewarding, behaviors that are leaders that are modeling this behavior. But I guess a couple other things that I would say, similar with the interview process, really educating hiring managers on, kind of the biases and preferences that naturally we all have, right, in the interviews, whether that's, reworking the job description as already mentioned, and, some people, I'll call them college snobs, they've honed in on where the person went to school and all of these things. But I think all of us know and recognize that regardless of where someone went to undergrad or law school or a master's program, if they have the experience for the role, right, and similar to what Logan was saying with the competencies, if they're able to demonstrate through their experience and what they've listed, and it matches with what the organization is looking at, try to avoid, and whether you want to call it a blind resume process where you're removing certain information, or even something not as formal, just really trying to get past some of the biases that we may have on certain institutions, because as we know, there are many underrepresented groups that just for many reasons have not had the opportunity to attend schools with certain names. So really being mindful of that, and then just really being thoughtful about the sourcing channels, not just going to the same sources all the time. I think I saw an organization a few months ago that I forget which organization it was, but they were like, oh, there aren't Black people out there, or there aren't women out there to kind of fill these roles. But you're waiting, you're not looking at, passive candidates, right? You're waiting for people to apply for these opportunities instead of going out and seeking and looking in other places to source candidates, and being more intentional about what you're doing. So really kind of shaking up the sourcing piece, going out there, putting the organization out there, and looking for passive candidates. And I think kind of for the hiring manager on the onboarding side, really trying to engage with new hires effectively from the very beginning. And this is not, just for diverse individuals, but I think certainly if you're a diverse individual coming in, when we start talking about inclusion from the beginning, if that person or group of people are not handled kind of in a way that makes them feel included from the very beginning, that's going to have an impact on the morale and their experience moving forward. I guess lastly, I'll just say, just going back to the job description, and really just, when we're communicating about these opportunities, whatever we're putting out there, whether it's in the job description or otherwise, really focusing on, what are our, what flexibilities do we have in the workplace, whether it's the religious holidays or schedule, can this role be remote, for instance? I think we're all learning now with COVID that yes, it can probably, but how much further can we reach when we are allowing a little bit more flexibility? So whether that's a woman, a mother or a father, or, whatever the need for flexibility may be, we're just going to, further make our, organizations more inclusive. So thinking about all those things as a hiring manager, instead of, like Logan said, just kind of doing the same thing, dusting off the old job description as before.
Latoya, you just referenced what Shuchi referenced in the beginning, that volatility through the pandemic has caused us and allowed us to think differently about flexibility and where we want to work. So I really appreciate you raising that.
Val, I'd like to, if I may, also just add one trap that I think hiring managers can often fall into is to look for what we call culture fit. And what ends up happening is that we hire people like ourselves, right? We hire our buddies, we hire our best mates. Where we really need to be thinking about is culture add. What can a person contribute to our culture that is different, that might challenge us, that might cause the disruption we need for innovation in our organization?
Absolutely. And that's what it is. It can be harder work, right? For a greater return on the investment, but harder work, particularly upfront. I appreciate that, Shuchi. And I do see we have a couple of questions, and I think we'll have time to get to some of those. But just quickly, we know there are likely folks on the call who are seeking employment, who are likely underrepresented in some way with their identity in the organization that they're where they're seeking employment. So a couple of thoughts from Logan and Shuchi on ideas for those who are seeking employment who might be underrepresented in one of the ways that we're discussing. Logan, do you want to go first? Oh, Shuchi, go ahead.
I was going to say, there was any of you who get the Washington Post, there was a really interesting article last Sunday about how Generation Z and Y are really looking at companies now to question and challenge what they're doing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think as a job seeker, if you know that that is an important value you hold, really challenge the organizations to demonstrate that and be very conscious of what you experience in the interview process. And frankly, don't be afraid to give feedback, because companies today are looking to understand their candidate experience better, and it's very hard to do. So as much as you can offer constructive guidance and feedback, after the process is complete, regardless of the outcome, organizations really value that. But observe. I'll never forget when I interviewed at an organization, I looked around in the offices to see who is there, right? And what are the women and underrepresented minorities doing, right? You can kind of guess what kind of jobs people might be in, sometimes based on their physical location in the organization. Now, we don't have that luxury today, but we have a wealth of information online that we can use to do research and understand what the values of the organization are, what their greater purpose is, and really whether that is lip service or whether they are actually making the investments and creating impact in in their economy, in their society, that show that this is a true value and commitment for them.
Or I think we could probably spend a whole webinar on the topic of when you're seeking employment, what's your willingness and ability to join an organization where you need to help create that change versus joining one that is already there. There's a lot inside of what you just said, Shuchi, so thank you. Logan, advice for those people who are seeking employment.
Yeah, those folks who are seeking employment, I mean, it's similar to what was said. I think one thing is reaching out, directly to individuals who are already in an industry or a role or work for a company that you're already interested in. I think that, when you're looking for a job, if you're unemployed or if you're looking for something else, some people will tell themselves that they won't reach out. And I'm a huge optimist, so I believe in people. I believe the best in folks. And I think a lot of people really do want to help where they can, when they can. So reaching out to a single source via LinkedIn or whatever channel is something that I would recommend. And then the other thing is keeping an eye out, of course, for opportunities, but taking it a step further beyond simply applying and hoping that something is, lands in the database or in the system, right? Like if there is a recruiter that is clearly called out on a job description, right, then follow up with an email and a brief explanation and an attached resume. That alone is something that sets applicants apart would set a single applicant apart from the other applicants. I think, and I know because I've done that in my own experience. So I think those are the two things. Is just kind of owning what you can do as an individual as much as possible to set yourself apart. And the other note that I'll mention on what I said earlier, which is like reaching out to someone who does something that you'd be interested in doing or is working somewhere that you're interested in, even if there isn't an opportunity today, right? Next season, later in the year, something could come up and someone could say, oh, you know what? Val did reach out to me about this program manager role and someone is going on leave or someone just left for a different reason, right? So you never know, how something like that can turn itself around.
Thanks, Logan. Yeah, there is a different mindset between waiting for someone to say you are a good candidate for this versus you saying, I want you to know, I believe I'm a good candidate for something. And it's a different mindset in the job search. Yeah.
Raising your hand, yeah.
Excellent. Thanks. So we have a couple of questions, and thanks for those who have sent them in. So the first one came from Jeremy early on, and I think a really good one that we might be able to address, and that is that specific strategies that companies can do to diversify their slate for open positions. So some best practices around that. Anyone want to give a shout out that feels like they have a ready answer that has worked in their organizations?
Val, I can speak to that. I think really the answer lends itself to some of the points we've already discussed here. One, which is really looking at how do you source candidates? Do you keep going to the same sources over and over again, expecting a different result? You have to really see how you can broaden and cast a wider net and create a wider funnel. And then second, the job description. At SAP, we have a technology that analyzes job descriptions to determine where there is bias in the job description. So for example, let's say you're hiring a salesperson. Often you'll see positions for sales, you'll see descriptions that say things like hard charging sales executive wanted. Well, that really often turns women off, right? Or you'll see other words like rock star in the job description. That's going to turn a lot of people off as well. So one has to be very conscious about the language they're using in the job description and what kind of perception it may or may not create. And there's ways to be very inclusive in your job descriptions. And then once you start hiring, how are you interviewing candidates? To Logan's earlier point, is the process consistent? Do you have diverse slates? And sometimes having diverse slates is something organizations have to really push, because oftentimes you'll see that talent attraction organizations are incented by throughput. So they're very interested in getting candidates through the process very quickly. But it goes back to that point I made earlier about sometimes you've got to allow for inefficiency in your process to encourage diversity and that resiliency that's going to arise from it. So ensuring that your recruiters are really sourcing talent that is more diverse is going to perhaps take longer, but it's in the end going to really push the outcome you want. And then last, I would say to be very outcome focused, right? You've got to hold your people accountable, and you've got to ensure that they are acting and behaving in the way that's going to create an impact here.
Yeah, and I would completely agree. I mean, I love what Shuchi talked about with the, like the gender decoder and all of those things that can help with job descriptions. And I think, in terms of if you're using external recruiters, I've in some of the work I've done, you build in some of the language into the agreements to talk about your expectations on diversity, right? In terms of who they're sourcing, because they are, oftentimes driven, as she said, by kind of the quantity. And so if you can kind of focus them a little bit, help them focus and ensure that they're on the same page in terms of, we do have an expectation that that we have a certain, whether it's a certain percentage or an attempt to have a certain slate of diverse candidates. And I also think utilizing, some of our employee resource groups, right? If you have different groups in the organization that you can leverage in terms of who they know, we've discussed already kind of this idea, we all know where people kind of just tap whoever they think, right? So whether it's senior leaders in the organization only tapping their friends, and us just kind of seeing the repeated backgrounds and characteristics in individuals, but opening it up and sending job descriptions or internal postings to folks in the organization and say, hey, does anyone know anyone, right? And so now you're branching this out to the Black employee network, the Asian network, the LGBTQ network, and so you're getting kind of a wider net and perhaps even attaching more incentives around referrals, right? And so you're really encouraging these diverse groups of people to kind of branch out into their networks. And then of course, using, various platforms, different platforms for sourcing than you would ordinarily use. So I think those are some, strategies that kind of help increase the diversity.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I think I'd like to pluck another question out of the chat. It's a little bit self-invested, and we likely all have had DE&I committees within the organizations that we work, and we probably have experienced a range of effectiveness of those employee groups who come together, either motivated by leadership or comes from the base, right? A groundswell of interest from the employee base. So if you could talk a little bit about DE&I committees and the work that they do and how they might be most effective. Logan, do you have a DE&I committee at Walt Disney?
Yes, we do. I'm sorry, Val, can you repeat that question? It was cutting out a little bit on my end.
Oh, sure. And Logan, it is in the chat as well, but essentially how DE&I committees within organizations can be effective. And how do we ensure that they are? What are the structures that help them to be effective in their
okay, yes. Thank you so much. Yes, so committees, absolutely, there are a few. I think one of the biggest things is understanding, if the organization has a DE&I strategy, right? Those committees should align itself to the strategy as best as it can, right? Like, let's work with what's working. I have a lot of things, and that's one of them. And I think, that will help the committee kind of guide itself on the ground, so to speak, when they're working as sort of these DE&I champions to kind of help the larger organization, right? So if there is an approach already to talent acquisition or to recruiting, then let's see what the corporate level, the organizational level is, and then tweak that. And then run with it and execute it. So I think that's the biggest thing is aligning. I think with committees, sometimes committees and subcommittees, people want to kind of shoot at the hip, off at the hip. I'm not sure how the expression goes, but you know what I mean? And then they will lose focus as to what like the company is working on, what the actual company DE&I strategy is, because it's not just about Latoya is saying, well, I just, I want this one dimension, and it's a broader effort. And to the earlier point that I think everyone has in their own way made, this work is we're all responsible for this work. It is a journey for the individual as well as the organization, and because it is a responsibility for the organization, every individual helps make up the organization. So find a way in to kind of run with something that's already been proposed at a higher level in strategy and build on that.
And I think, Val, I think that's a great point. And I think, it really helps, I think, with what what has been known as kind of this fatigue, whether it's Black fatigue, women fatigue, all the fatigues.
Sure.
Because, when you're trying to, and I've seen this in organizations where, they're separate from the, there's already a structure or some sort of, bigger strategy. And then you have these different ERGs or groups that are kind of trying to go off and do their own thing. That's exhausting, right? And so when we look at back to 2020, a lot of the Black resource focused, African-American focused resource groups were exhausted, right? Because it's like they're creating things off the ground. They're trying to, run at lightning speed. The company, is looking like, well, what can we do? What we can do? Looking only at those individuals. But, that's a problem, right? When you either don't have the corporate strategy, so there's nothing to funnel down, or you have maybe a corporate strategy, but then you have groups that are trying to recreate the wheel. But the other piece, and kind of a part of the question around, kind of how do you ensure diversity and, diversity of thought and all those things, I think it's, connected to that. It's like, you don't want to just have, the Black employees or this tailored to the Black employees, right? You want to have, whether it's sponsors, leaders, executive, whoever in the organization should be, visible and participating and helping to lead and guide these organizations so that it does not just fall on, X group or X people within. And I think that also just encourages allyship across the board, right? So if you have, X senior executive who's a man, as a sponsor of the women's network, that maybe encourages other men to get involved because they realize, this is not just for women, right? This group needs men to be a part of this. And that's where you get, I think, some of the diversity of thought, and you get, quite frankly, the people who need to hear the message. They're hearing that message, right? Instead of having women just preach to women, and so forth. So I think, being more thoughtful and strategic, kind of, to what Logan is saying from the top level, and then just having that funnel down without a lot of recreation. I mean, with the exception of, making it localized, right? If you're a global organization, you have a global strategy. Of course, someone in Houston, Texas versus, somewhere in India, maybe their local chapters will be very different in terms of how they apply the strategy, but the strategy is still the strategy. So I think thinking of it in that way is helpful.
That's
Val,
awesome.
one thing I would add is that, our employee resource groups are extraordinarily important and really important for cultivating a culture of inclusion. They are instrumental for winning hearts and minds. I think what often happens in organizations is that the burden of the work around these topics falls to them, right? Or it's relegated to a DEI committee. Well, as I alluded to earlier in the discussion, this is a business issue. This is not something we relegate to another group. So while those organizations and those infrastructures are incredibly important and serve an important focus, how we think about inclusion has to transform. And until it is treated like a business issue, we are not going to be able to move the needle. And that is happening, right? We are seeing organizations that are doing that. If you look at organizations like Accenture, like 3M, like our organization, we are creating a platform and structure where this is driven by leaders across the organization and not just the various committees or resource groups. They're part of that strategy.
Yeah, that's a wonderful, driven by leaders and with employees from the across the organization. I think it's a theme that we've heard again and again throughout today. So seeing that it is 12:59 on my clock, we want to be respectful of everyone's times. I'd like to bring this to a close. I'd like to thank Michael. Michael, thanks for popping on here so I could thank you with everyone seeing you for the vision and the passion and supporting the careers and networks of our William & Mary alumni. I think this professional week is your brainchild, and you also have programming throughout the year. So this is a concentrated week but Michael does not stop at the end of Professionals Week. So, and also a special thanks to our, what I would call our philanthropic volunteer leaders, those who have shared their time and talents with us today. So Shuchi, Latoya, and Logan, thank you. Thank you very much for the work that you do, the passion you bring to it, and what you've shared with our alumni William & Mary community today. So I invite everyone to join in the 2 additional sessions that are focused on inclusion later today. 2 o'clock, Tamisha Williams, Masters of Education from 2010, will present on ways to build capacity for social justice efforts in the workplace. And at 4 o'clock, Professor Karen Wolf, William & Mary scholar John Oda Robinson, and alumna and William & Mary parent Jana Atwater, class of '84, will be illuminating ways to cultivate a more inclusive workplace for neurodiverse individuals. So with that, I thank you as members of the William & Mary community for investing your time and your busy day to join us. Universal inclusion happens as a result of individual actions. And thank you for taking action today just by joining us. And so, Michael, I will toss it back to you to bring us to a final close.
I think you're on mute.
Michael, I think you're on mute, or we cannot hear you.
I am standing up on standing ovation in my musical world. Bravi to all of you for a wonderful hour. And again, echoing all of Val's comments. First off, thank you, Val, for being an amazing colleague. As you can see, she is just a terrific partner, a mentor, and terrific friend of mine in the field. And really do recommend reiterating getting to know her and getting more involved for you that are watching today and in the recording, because the initiatives that she is doing and with her team of great colleagues that you'll learn from in the afternoon, there are some amazing things happening, and we want you to be engaged and help us drive it forward together as a community. And Shuchi, thank you so much for kicking us off. Logan and Latoya, thank you as well for adding amazing perspectives. I know you were both involved with William & Mary in different areas, with the law school and just with our amazing Sean Glover's programs and so forth. So I think you do already a lot, but this was a terrific addition to your portfolio of engagement with William & Mary. So thank you. I just want to say a shout out to everyone. Stay engaged with the rest of the week. But like Val said, we do this all throughout the year. It's important to thank those that have helped you in your professions through the William & Mary community. So to give a shout out this week, this is a perfect time to put a hashtag WM Professionals Week to somebody that made a difference. I know, Shuchi, you mentioned a few in your opening remarks of some faculty and Dean Sadler and all of the people that influenced you. And that's a terrific example of how it pays forward the great community that we've built here. And, it's a terrific way to support each other in your efforts as one William & Mary community. So thank you. Continue to learn and share, and have a wonderful afternoon. And I look forward to continuing this conversation for many years to come.
Thank you,
care.
Michael. Thank you, Val.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.